This is an interview with Don Graham. The date is November 8th, 1993, and we're in Ottawa. Good morning, Don.
Good morning, Linda.
Can't quite get your voice here.
I'll try it again then. Good morning, Linda.
Great.
Is it the volume?
Yeah.
I never get the volume right if I can just say a few little things at the volume, which is the right volume.
We got good
And that
volume.
comes on.
Tape's running. We're in good shape.
That's good. You're starting at the beginning of the tape?
It's starting at the beginning.
Not in the middle of Humphrey Carver's, I hope.
I don't think so. You're at your own tape. Thank you very much for taking time to talk with me today. I'd like to ask you some questions about your life as a landscape architect and your involvement in the profession. Maybe we could begin with your schooling. I've looked at your resume. Maybe you could just tell me a little bit about your undergraduate work, where you studied, what you studied, and we'll go from
Well, on that, I was born in Montreal, and so I went through the Montreal Protestant School Board system of education, which was a huge high school, and the emphasis at that time, in the 40s, was on science. So when they looked at plant materials, when they looked at landscapes, when they looked at geography, at the time the stress was on science. And I guess a lot of students at that time thought that that was the future, and were looking for jobs where they could fit into being a scientist or an engineer or something like that. I guess architecture and landscape architecture were relatively unknown to kids in high school. If I can go back that far, just go back to high school, because quite often you talk to many people, they'll say they decided on their career or what they're going to do in later life in high school or even before high school. But Montreal at that time was quite different than the Montreal today. At that time, we thought that the French-speaking element were always just on the other side of the hill, the other side of the mountain. And the school was not exactly a bilingual school, so any French I've learned has been on the street or subsequent to that in practice. And at that time, there weren't many of les Anglais students, as kids, speaking French, because there were the differences in the different neighborhoods, and so you didn't really get into it. But so the whole progress of the education in the province of Quebec is quite different today. And it's something I just mentioned because it's quite noticeable. And I think it's a big improvement because there's more recognition on what all the cultures are bringing together in Montreal, which didn't seem to be there when I was in high school. It's a fact now that the high schools have changed so considerably too, and the vocations available for people have changed a lot. Anyway, the only place I could find in graduating from high school was to get into engineering. It seemed to be the only thing that was had to do with land development. So I tried 1 year of engineering at McGill, and decided no, that wasn't it either, because engineering wasn't oriented to what I really thought I wanted to do. So then I went into agriculture. Agriculture faculties at MacDonald College at St. Anne de Bellevue on the island of Montreal, on the west end of the island. It was a 4-year course. And at that time I leaned towards general agriculture and horticulture. And in the 3rd year met Don Pettit, who was on our list for landscape architecture, to some of the people on your interviewing list. And Don Pettit was there for a course in what he gave as landscape architecture in 3rd year. So that was the first time I'd been introduced to landscape architecture per se. And Don Pettit, of course, had spent some time at Guelph, and he spent some time at Harvard, and so he opened the eyes of our small class of about 8 or 9 people in agriculture, opened up a few doors leading to landscape architecture.
What year would that have been? You started in 1952, or did you graduate?
No, graduated in 1952.
So that's about 51 then?
So that would have been 51. Don was there.
And teaching the course in landscape architecture? Was it called landscape architecture?
I think it was called landscape design, although he made it quite clear that he was a landscape architect and what he had done, and his teaching of it involved the whole gamut of history and some design orientation, which was new in these science-oriented curricula, such as agriculture and engineering. So that was a kind of a fresh breeze, and then after then, I joined a nursery company and a contracting company doing landscape construction. But that was only for about a year. And then I moved with the National Capital Commission. That would have been in about 1953. National Capital Commission's in Ottawa, as you know. They have they're responsible to Parliament for the National Capital Region. At that time, they were called the Federal District Commission. And the Federal District Commission changed to the National Capital Commission some years later. Mandate much the same, although they've oriented largely into planning at the present time, with some responsibility, of course, in urban design and landscape architecture, but that's a digression.
What was their focus at that time? What was their focus in 1953?
Well, they were known for their parks in 1953. In fact, from the Second World War, before the Second World War and through the war and subsequent, up until about the 60s, they were quite famous for their parks, their gardens, their large open spaces. And then following the Grébert plan, Jacques Grébert, planner, drew up a plan for the city, which was adopted in 1950. Acquisition started on the Greenbelt, so it became regional planning and regional landscape architectural projects. So from an education point of view, I guess education continued on at the NCC, where I worked with Edward I. Wood. And I wish you could interview him, but he passed away some years ago. And but he really, I think, in my opinion, was one of the Canada's leading, if not one of the first, landscape architects in public works. The type of work we were doing there, again, kind of was quite educational, because I was involved in landscape construction, building of parks, because they did their own construction, and brought in contractors occasionally, but essentially they did it with their own workforces. Edward I. Wood did the design, working with his staff. He was the chief landscape architect, although he didn't call himself chief. I remember at the time he specifically said, "I'm not the chief landscape architect, I am the landscape architect." And he also had under his mandate at that time, so I was a part of it, the design, construction, and maintenance. So he had the three, what are now quite often separated, departments under the landscape architect, or within his direction, or within his particular department. And so I was able to see all facets of how he was doing the design. And this whet my appetite for landscape architecture.
Just to digress there before we continue on with your next phase, what do you know about Edward Wood's background and his training?
What I'll do is I'll give you a little screed on Edward I. Wood.
Okay.
His colleagues call him Ned Wood. And he lived in Ottawa and was really instrumental in setting up a lot of the physical design at the National Capital Commission. So, but rather than go into it.
Okay, all right. And what were some of the things, you said that sort of whetted your appetite, what were some of the things that appealed to you about what he was doing or what you were doing with him that were?
Well, it's interesting, you sort of coming from a city, getting into agriculture, you don't really know what the potential is in landscape architecture until you work with a landscape architect. Now, Don Pettit at MacDonald College, he got into the first phase of it, and I began to see, hey, there was something there. And then and then with Edward I. Wood, you began to realize there was a position, there was a place for landscape architecture in public works. And public works at that time was attractive because of the authority which he had, and because of the number of projects that he was doing. And as you'll see from his little curriculum vitae, he played a role in the country. He was a major factor in my development anyway. For better or worse, it sort of got me started in public works.
And of course, at that time, economically, the country was in a position to be able to pay for public works. Was there good money around for projects that were being done?
No, you're right. Parks were being developed. Parkways were popular. The Gatineau Parkway, the Ottawa River Parkway, things of that kind. development of the green belt, the purchase of lands for open space. There were funds there that aren't available at this time. And so it was an opportunity there was a window for this kind of opportunity there. And so I sort of, just to continue the time sequence in my mind, I guess at that time I said, well, look, as soon as possible. And after I'd been there for 5 years, about 5 years, I was 53, about 5 years. Then I looked around for how I might get a degree in landscape architecture, because there were none available in Canada at this time. And as you'll see from people of my age, we always looked towards the United States, because these were the only faculties that were open and available. In the background, you hear the grandfather clock. I'll have to, if you could pull the plug on that one, we can't. It was a difficult decision to make as to where you went, because there are a number of good schools, but Ned Wood had been to Harvard and had taken some courses there, and a friend of mine had also been at the school, Eric Harkness. Eric Harkness was a landscape architect that had been working with project planning in Toronto with Macklin Hancock. And he had been to Harvard the year before and suggested that I give it a try. So anyway, they accepted me and I went to Harvard and was there for 3 years. With an agricultural degree, they wanted you to take the full 3-year courses at the Harvard Graduate School of Design. And so that started me off. And so I guess I was quite surprised to suddenly find a whole lot of other students there in much the same boat. In the graduate school, they had undergraduate degrees, some in landscape architecture, some in agriculture, some in engineering, architecture. And so both from the professors and from the students, it was exciting, frightening. It was new, a different approach, of course, to design rather than the usual scientific or hands-on maintenance and construction.
What were some of their approaches to design?
Well, at the time, Hideo Sasaki was the head of the school, or he was teaching. No, he wasn't the head at that time. It was Walter Chambers who was the head of the school, but both of these gentlemen had a broad experience in private practice and in fields of planning and landscape architecture and urban design. So their approach was, at that time, Harvard was taking a sort of an approach towards urban design in landscape architecture. And the influence of Charles Eliot, and some of the early landscape architects also opened the doors to their courses in regional landscape architecture, large-scale park systems and public works. So most of the student projects, depending on the individual students, of course, and what they'd been through, took advantage of this. And so over a period of 3 years, with, I don't know as I need to dwell on that too long, because it's complicated, and there's another whole book, of course. But it I think was useful in sort of, in that many Canadians went to the United States at that time, by many, a dozen or so, and came back, all enthused, either from Harvard or California or many of the other schools, and to practice in Canada.
Who were some of the other teachers at Harvard that were there at the time you were there? Was Walter Gropius there?
Walter Gropius was there, and he had, I think, he wasn't teaching at that time because he had retired at that time. But of course, he influenced the whole Bauhaus, German Bauhaus background teaching of the School of Architecture, which we were with for a year. We were actually taking architecture with the architects for 1 year. So, and of course, he had an office in Cambridge, and a lot of the students would either work there or go to his office and see what the office was doing. Walter Chambers, as I mentioned, was practicing in Massachusetts then. Norman T. Newton, who is was a teacher of landscape architectural history and a tremendous influence on all of the students. And as I mentioned, Hideo Sasaki was there, and other members of his firm would come in. And Siegfried Gideon, actually, who wrote Space, Time, and Architecture. Nothing to do with outer space, but this was his title. Space, Time, and Architecture and he brought in people from all over the world to give sections of lectures and tremendous slide collections on architectural history. So again, that was an eye-opener for this particular agricultural student and science-oriented student. And of course, they brought in visiting professors from California. We had ECBO there at one time. Ian McHarg came up for a discussion session. Jacqueline Turritt, Tyrwhitt, and she had worked with Corbusier in India. And so as young people in this environment hearing from the world on architects, planners, landscape architects, from this particular area, it was exciting and set a standard of excellence, I think, that, I guess most of us have tried to meet. But it was good fun, a lot of hard work, and I think has perhaps influenced Canadian landscape architecture a lot. Not only Harvard, but University of California and all the other schools in Pennsylvania and Michigan.
I wonder, too, from that perspective, how do you think there was a difference between what you learned in the United States that you would be able to practice in Canada, or do you think that the principles that they taught you were fairly universal in that sense, or do you think that you were getting an American training and applying it to a Canadian scene?
No, that's a good question. You've had some practice at this. Even though I'm number 3, you've obviously... No, that gives some direction to a thought here. I think they taught the principles, and a tree is a tree, and people are people everywhere, and there are many different hues and backgrounds. But I think one of the strong things they taught, and many of the other design schools taught the same thing, were the principles of, or basic approach to design. The initial inventory and research, moving into the analysis, which as an area for a particular profession is so important. Synthesizing and developing a synthesis or a plan or a beginning, leading into a concept, which is then vital to carry on into doing things like working drawings and specifications. And then leading into construction, because they had construction courses, and we would see construction. All of these principles. And then, of course, leading into the maintenance of landscapes, which was something I was particularly keen on because it was something I had done before. And so each student brought whatever they had done before. And perhaps I learned more from the students than I did from the professors, because they had some good students there, particularly those that had had some experience in landscape architecture or brought something in from architecture and from engineering. These all gave a different slant to it. So I don't know if that's answering that particular question, but it's a good one because this is a point that I'd like to leave with you on that little diagram that I showed you, diagramming the process, because without that process, I don't know where any designer would be. You'd be floundering around in the research stage and never getting out of it, perhaps, or seeing what the research might produce in terms of educational value and subsequently practice with the research, education, practice type of little diagram or little triangle.
One of the things that my question is also leading to is what then becomes Canadian about Canadian landscape architecture?
Well, it's one thing that I really have never really tried to dig up and think about too much. It's not something I think is crucial to what we do in Canada. It doesn't need to be necessarily Canadian, in as much as a lot of the early landscape architecture, a lot of the people I hired in my firm when it started after my leaving the NCC were American in any event, practicing in Canada and had to adapt their methods of practice and their plant materials and their interpretation of what people wanted to a Canadian environment. A lot of our early landscape architecture here, well, early being the 60s, 70s, say, was done by American landscape architects practicing for Canadian offices. And so it's such a mix, as is Canada, a cultural mix. Unlike the melting pot philosophy of the United States, Canada tends to look. If you're on the West Coast, there's a West Coast use of materials and landscape process, perhaps. And if you're in the Maritimes, hey, they very strongly feel about their rocks and coastline and how these are handled and the pattern of agriculture on the farms on the coast. These are all things which influence that. And of course, you might know a little bit about the prairies in the West. And there again, the kind of space there and the feeling of sky and just the feeling of immense spaces without the mountains in view, unless you're in Alberta. They influence it more than anything I think you could learn at school. School.
Do you think that that's, when you say they influence it, do you think that that's something that you just kind of absorb by being in that environment? Because you mentioned the rocks of the East Coast, the prairies. Do you think that it's just sort of something you absorb that you then combine with the design principles you learn in school? And is that Canadian?
That's well said. No, I think it's that's what makes it Canadian. And materials being Canadian, and the way of life being Canadian. Another little sketch I have here, which is relative to this process, is with the people and the land and buildings. In other words, what they build, either architecture or bridges or structures. And you take that and you place that in California, you have one thing happening. In Hawaii, you have something else happening. And in the Maritimes, it has another twist. As you use the local history, you use the local background and certainly the indigenous materials, the plant materials.
I think, the more I listen to comments, I think that seems to be one of the critical issues, is the plant material. Mr. Carver mentioned the other day that there's no point in growing herbaceous material in a garden in Ottawa because it has the hottest summers and the coldest winters, and it's just not a functional kind of thing to do. It's okay in Vancouver, but it doesn't work in Ottawa. And so even I think that maybe Canada, the regionalism of Canada, might be a very interesting place to look at what is landscape architecture across this country. I don't think it's going to be a Canadian-wide thing. I think it'll be a much more regional sort of image.
No, that's true. But just to take that just as another point of departure, almost in parenthesis, Humphrey Carver's comment about the perennials is true, and people try to do things here that they do in Surrey or in England, or in Britain, or places in Germany or Europe, and it doesn't work here in the same way. It might in Niagara, but it won't in Quebec City. And so obviously that's true. But I just want to touch that point about it being plant materials, plant materials being one of the major things. And I don't agree with that, although we use plant materials in talking to a client as being something special. We have, it's so clever to know the botanical names. I'm being a little sarcastic about that, but in case it doesn't come through on the tape. But because it's often overused, when in reality the stone, the weather, the heat, the cold, the wind, the rain, all of these things, which are different wherever we are. And I keep going back to the people being different and specific to almost a particular area. The plant materials are overstressed. And that's from somebody who started in agriculture, had a background in horticulture and plant maintenance and parks. I really feel that they're a little overstressed, and of course we're well known by the fact that landscape architects, horticulturalists, gardeners, all of the words which relate to this thing, I look at plant materials as being perhaps one of the key pieces of the design. And they are a key piece, of course. You can't argue that they're not, but they've been overstressed. And of course aren't that vital part of any particular canvas if you're in the sort of the center of the city, as opposed to, say, a beautiful garden in the suburbs or in a park. So I don't know, anyway, I'm trying to make a point and then I'm dancing all around it. The point being, I think that my practice, and I only speak specifically, Whereas I've always, you use plant materials all the time and they're an important part of the component. I don't think I would like to be only, saying that I'm designing things with plant materials. It tends to be the image, and it's an image that I've always had to fight a little bit against, so that I'm still able to design without being buttonholed as a horticulturalist or a person who's handy with designing with plants. Not to put down the plants, but they are overemphasized. And this is one thing I've noticed has not changed in the 40 years that I've been in practice. People are still immediately seeing the plant material out front, and then the other design components being much less important, which is, I don't think, the case. I'll touch on that later, but it has a point.
Just to play devil's advocate for one more moment, what do you think is Canadian then about Canadian landscape architecture? If it isn't if the plant material isn't critical, then what?
Well, it's a question that I think a lot of landscape architects ask themselves all the time, because one likes to have, if you're with government or if you're in private practice, a special thing, which on the world scene will look Canadian. Perennial gardens are from Great Britain, in the sense of famous perennial gardens done by great landscape architects in Great Britain. But the question about a Canadian landscape architecture and Canadian landscape architects, I don't really believe that there is a specific Canadian landscape architecture. Could be wrong, but I'll take that particular stance just for purposes of this question, and say that because it's done by people, by human beings, and that Canadian human beings come from so many different parts of the world and bring to Canada all of these childhood memories and their knowledge of materials, and they bring it to Canada. And then they practice in Canada, whether you're from Poland, you're from Britain, you're from Denmark, you're from Germany, you're from India, and we have all of this world population practicing here. I don't see how you could have anything you would call a Canadian landscape architecture. And I think the Americans, in the United States, I should say, North Americans in general, and South Americans, because they have quite a mix too of different groups from all around the world. They have regional landscape architecture. And certainly the work which I do in Quebec City will be different than the work that I'll do in Niagara Falls or in Victoria, BC, although I haven't done anything in Victoria, BC. if I were to do something there. And so, but just to carry that a little further, because it really is, it's always a fascination, and perhaps wastes just a bit of time, but it's a good time waster because it brings out the point that I think Canadians have to offer a very, very rich tapestry of different kinds of landscape architecture, and that it isn't only a specific thing you can immediately recognize. One thought for a while you could recognize a California landscape, and Garrett Ekbo for a while when we were in school, and subsequently, seemed to reflect what would be a sort of a California landscape architectural solution. And then Lawrence Halprin came along and changed that somewhat, because he wasn't using the same forms or the same sort of diagrams and analysis that Ekbo was using. And when you look at Canadian architecture, it too changes. Although in some respects it doesn't. They're still putting up Western architecture in Calgary and Eastern, I should say West Coast type architecture in Calgary with the shingles and what have you, and wood use, where Calgary perhaps is better suited to some other kind. And landscapes in Calgary may try and reflect some of the British Columbian rough rivers by using stones and this kind of thing, when in reality they could perhaps use other materials brought in locally. But then that's a bit of a digression. The thing I think that is crucial to perhaps creating a feeling in others' minds about Canada's landscape architecture, which I would like to do. I think this would be a good idea because it would attract talent, young people to Canada so they could practice in this environment. So we should, I think, say I wouldn't say this to you, perhaps not to my colleagues, but I might use it if talking to clients and to students, attracting them, because I would like to attract talent to Canada. Just as Americans keep claiming they're getting the best Canadians going to the States, either doctors or lawyers or Indian chiefs. But and in that score, I think we can say Canada has something special to offer, in that if we have contrasts, hey, if you really want to see contrasts, come to Canada. In landscape and in people and in populations, the way they're distributed, we could claim to have that. And so there's a challenge for practitioners, a challenge for young designers and older designers alike. The other aspect about practice in Canada, and it doesn't have anything to do with the climate or the things I just mentioned, is that if you're practicing in public works, I think public works practice in Canada is quite different from public works practice in the United States because of the political, because our politics are somewhat different. Systems of state government are different than systems of political government. And so working within the government context, being employed by government as a public servant, I think in Canada you're given much more opportunity, perhaps. That's my opinion anyway. You have this opportunity to do something which might reflect the politics of Canada. Politics with a small p, not a particular party politics, but the politics of the North are different than the politics of the Nickel Belt in Sudbury, or they're difficult than the politics of the Triangle, the Niagara, Toronto Triangle, or the Maritimes, or Far West, Victoria.
But then does that experience only come to a landscape architect, for instance, who is able to work in those different regions? If you're only ever able to work within one region, do you ever have that variety?
Well, one of the remarkable things about landscape architecture, unlike, say, practicing law or teaching school, the transference of your talents and your training from one region to another is very, very portable. And even within our own Canadian Society of Landscape Architects, your membership is portable from province to province in terms of being able to be member. It certainly is in the East, and I believe it is in the West. And anyway, it's not a big problem. Of knowledge, it's not a big problem. And if you go back to the principles, if you have good basic principles of design, and you have the design process well ingrained, then you can practice anywhere in the country, the far north or the south tip of Vancouver Island, and still accomplish a good piece of, as we're sort of with some tongue-in-cheek saying, Canadian landscape architecture. But I just review that aspect in that the public works side is an area that I would like to stress, since I spent about 12 to 15 years in public works as a public works civil servant, and I have many good things to say about that, as well as many questions which are raised in my mind. And then I spent another, say, 25 years in private practice, quite separate from that, although working with public works. It's like sort of moving outside the house and working not in-house, but out of house. And yet you still apply the same principles, but you have different, you have a different client, in that you're not employed by the client when you're in private practice in quite the same way as direct employment in public service.
How does that affect what you're able to do?
Well, it affects quite strongly what you're able to do, in that after one has been with a particular government department, and these vary from municipal, small town, to provincial, regional, to federal, national. And so that the difference is very dependent, that more than they do with a particular employer. But in my particular thing, I worked with the National Capital Commission, formerly the Federal District Commission, and in working with them, you work with public works, you work with museums, you work with national parks, you work with all the other agencies that touch upon Ottawa as the nation's capital. And the challenge was immense. I mean, it was just was so challenging and exciting. And as I say, being a civil servant, and this varied a bit, though, over the years. Like when I started with them back in the 50s, there was a method of practice at that time and a method of government expenditures, which we touched on earlier. They were larger and less controlled. Now they are quite controlled, seem to be somewhat smaller. This may change, and a lot less control than there was. There is more control now than there was back in the 50s. And so that perhaps there is less challenge. But I think that landscape architects, if they are working for public works, can make their own challenges. And this has happened with the new graduates coming out of school. This is a bit of a side issue here, but it is important that many of the new graduates are finding work with public agencies. And I think this is good because it's a great training ground. There's a little more room for movement there, since the bottom profit line isn't in front of you all the time. A little more room for movement, a place where one can gain experience, a place where one can work with people in private practice, in the allied professions as well as landscape architecture, and the opportunity of working anywhere in the country with different municipalities and different local governments.
So as long as the Canadian economy stays buoyant, then there'll be work in public works and landscape architects, we hope.
Yeah, we hope.
Yeah. Well, maybe we'll move on to a discussion perhaps of work that you've done. Either I think we've kind of touched on the early work experiences. Is there more there that you'd like to add? Or would you like to move
I think
on?
the problem in all of these interviews will be there's so much there. I've narrowed it down, and we can talk about some of the work which I thoroughly enjoyed and I think has made some contribution.
Okay, let's do that then.
And we can do that.
Okay.
The earlier work experiences, as I mentioned, have built up to that, and each one has its own particular little facet: public works, private practice, and so forth. But perhaps, and I always find it easier too when talking, if you're showing slides, I guess you found the same thing. If you're showing slides, you can talk to the slide.
Exactly.
So if you can,
Yeah,
so the visual clue gives you something to get on with. In this case, we're not dealing with that, but I have a visual clue in terms of thinking of 3 jobs, and it relates to things like working for government and working with government.
Okay.
Both can be the same thing, of course, but I mean employed with directly as an employee or a civil servant. Working with the National Capital Commission, this is working with the federal government, working with as a civil servant. I think I derive a lot of satisfaction from 3 types of works. One was the large-scale parkway development. And in the 50s, parkways were a place where government was spending money. Municipalities were spending it on street tree improvements. They were spending it on parkways as well. And parkways were defined as a roadway which was sort of going from nowhere to nowhere, in the sense that it wasn't meant to get you from A to B, but you were supposed to enjoy it while you were traveling on it. This was the theory at that time. Today, this wouldn't be used in the same way because you'd never get funding from a road going from nowhere to nowhere. And in the Ottawa area, the Gatineau Parkway, where I was able to work closely with Edward Iwood, who really laid it out, and it was my privilege and pleasure, as they say, to be able to walk this with him, to work out cutting in the brush, cutting of woods, where we wanted views opening out onto the Ottawa Valley, placing curves in areas where one would maximize the enjoyment of the driver and the passengers. And so that was an era of parkway design that I don't know if it will ever come back. I don't hope it comes back. The principles apply whether it's a bicycle pathway or a parkway, of course. But at that time, we were designing parkways. For some reason or other, the bicycles did not appear in the Canadian scene to be as important then as they do now, unfortunately. Because there were plenty of them on the roads then, and used, but they weren't a part of our horizon in designing the parkways here in Ottawa at that time. But subsequently, the bicycle paths were put in as a second phase of design. So that was the parkway. And then the urban parks. Since the National Capital had many urban parks, from Majors Hill Park to Parliament Hill to Justice Park to the Rideau River system as it goes through, the Colonel By Canal, the various other roadways and parkways going through the national capital area, and Ned Wood was there right up front with new and interesting ideas for design. One of the prime ones being, of course, the large-scale floral displays that Ottawa introduced to the North American scene, I believe, and were quite unique pieces of design, almost painting in the landscape with color for spring and summer bloom. And Ned worked very closely with Arthur Luscombe, who was a horticulturalist and one of his superintendents. And he and Art Luscombe provided me with a real open door to what one could do with large-scale flower beds. And I think a lot of this has spread. Of course, it was in Niagara Falls as well with the Niagara Parks Commission, and other cities picked up on it after the Second World War, having come to Ottawa, seeing the work that was done by this landscape architect, and were able to use it in their own cities. I think it was quite an introduction. And so we had the urban scene with its flowers and with its roads and with its urban parks. And the third thing with public works that I had an interesting time with was the Gatineau Park, a large-scale, almost wilderness in its scope, very close to a population of close to 1 million, and completely owned by the federal government, so they had some control on its design and development. And here is a whole scope which, of course, has been open to all through Canada through the national parks, and all over North America, if you reflect national parks in the United States as being a similar body. So those three areas were sort of one of the things that, in terms of projects, that I can now drive around and see and derive a tremendous amount of satisfaction from, seeing the both development of the plant material and how changes have been made in the parkways, introduction of the bicycle, and to these, and the introduction of different kinds of park use to them. Second thing was a large park we worked on with one of the local municipalities, and this was in the private practice condition at a time when my office, which we started in 1964, at that time we had completed projects in Montreal, and I'll get to one of those, Expo 67. But this one, I think, would have to be one that was very close to my heart, and this was done for the city of Nepean, Andrew Hayden Park. And there won't be many more of those built either, because the land was on a fill site, and in those days one was more able, or there was less restriction upon filling. It was in the Ottawa River, a particularly wide section of the river, so once the engineers had checked it out and the fill had been located, we were able to build a park there pretty close to 15 acres, 20 acres. And that particular park embodied a lot of the principles I've been talking about, a lot of the things that I was able to learn from my sessions with the people at the National Capital Commission and the experience with the public service. Well, Andrew Hayden Park has, again, that was done in the mid-70s. It's something I'm quite proud of. And it was proud in a sense, too, because we were able to function as a private practice. At that time, we had about 12 landscape architects as associates with me, and many of them were able to work on this with me, and we were able to do it as a collaborative effort within one office, working for the group with the city of Nepean. It was a special time, of course, too, in my practice, because during the 70s, I think I was very, very lucky, as were other practitioners at the time. We were able to get a lot of work. There was work in many municipalities for us right across Canada, and one where it was able to hire good landscape architects from both, well, in the beginning, in the late 60s and early 70s, from the United States, and then subsequently when the schools opened in Canada and were putting out graduates, people from Guelph, University of Toronto, joined my office. People like John Altorio, Ken McConnell, many others. And they worked on this particular park with me, and so that it was a group effort from D.W. Graham and Associates, at that time a going concern in landscape architecture. And I was able to bring people to Ottawa, young landscape architects, have the opportunity of being able to use them as designers on projects like Andrew Hayden Park. And then subsequently, they'd set up their own offices here in Ottawa. And at that time, my office was the only one in Ottawa, and now I think there are 15 or 20 different firms, individuals and groups that are working here in Ottawa, and it's a lot of satisfaction to me to see that. A lot of these young people now operating their own offices, working here in Ottawa, and Montreal, and Toronto. And I mentioned that particular park as sort of a number 2 thing because it allowed me to be able to do this. Without the work in private practice, you can't hire landscape architects. And I've mentioned this over the past few years. It's been a frustration. This is shared by a lot of my colleagues. The students are looking for work during the summers, and we're not able to get them to it. But during the 70s, it was wonderful. We had the funds, you had the profit capabilities. And we must have gone through in those 70s, by conservative estimate, $3 or $4 million worth of fees, which, as anybody operating a private practice will know, it comes in one door and goes out the other. But it was nevertheless able to employ a lot of landscape art, many landscape art. While we're talking about, I just decided I would say about 3 major projects, which to me represented a practice and represented working with other landscape architecture in Canada. And certainly a thing which helped me get into practice in 1964. To say the least, it helped. It was a major project, and that was Expo 67. And this produced work right across Canada, but specifically at Expo 67 in Montreal. And since I was from Montreal, and I speak French, and I love the province of Quebec, and hey, here was an opportunity of saying, okay, I can be a Quebec landscape architect, a Quebecois rather than the sort of Canadian. And so here was an opportunity for not only the Quebecois landscape architects to operate there, but of course, because of the way landscape architecture was set up at Expo with Bob Calvert, who was a landscape architect with Project Planning Associates, he brought in landscape architects from coast to coast. There must have been I think practically every office that was operating in the country at that time had a piece of Expo 67, either in their own hometown or on the site of the island in Montreal. And we were fortunate in getting half a dozen pavilions to work on, and in particular, Ile Notre-Dame Park. And here again, with that work in the office, I was able to bring in other landscape architects with me. And we set up an office in Montreal and did other work in Montreal at the time with schools and municipalities. And for a period of 7 or 8 years there, we had a going concern. And Expo 67 was special, I think, in one way to landscape architects in Canada. And none of the other world fairs that Canada has participated in have done this. And I give Bob Calvert, as a landscape architect, as the coordinator for landscape architecture at the fair, credit for this, and that he went afield, went further than just the Montreal region, and brought in landscape architectural private firms, because he was with a private firm and could appreciate both the need and the potential that existed. He brought them all in. I haven't thought about this for some years, but that was perhaps the unique thing to Expo as a Canadian land development thing. It had to happen quickly, so therefore people were able to focus on a particular location for a period of time. Over a period of 4 years, one was able to specify materials you would need, from plants to stone to the building components of structures in the landscape. And over that period of time, the whole thing was built, because when it opened, it opened. People arrived to enjoy Expo 67, and there it was. The trees were planted, the grounds were ready, the plazas were paved, and the lights were turned on. And it was the most exciting thing that I think touches any landscape architect. The project is ready, the doors are open, and people can come in, and you can see it in full use. It also enabled a lot of landscape architects and the word is meant in a positive sense, research and experiment with the handling of large crowds of people in an environment, in a park open space environment. And many things were tried. Good pieces of urban design were developed, park furniture, pavements, fences, lighting. A lot of new things were tried. And so it was a focus. Now, we all felt this would continue. Everyone would see this and say, hey, I want this type of designer, be it architect, engineer, or landscape architect, in my hometown. And that this would be transported not only to Canada, but the world. This was the word at the time. And this is why they hold world expositions, of course. But 2 years later in Montreal, I decided I better close my office there because the municipalities were not hiring us. And so we pulled back and just increased the size of the office in Ottawa, which was going well at the time. But the area around Montreal did not burgeon in terms of jobs available to landscape architects. Subsequently, there has been some growth, of course, as the young landscape architects have moved in from the Université de Montréal. But it's not a result of Expo. It's a result of other factors, I think, Linda. The fact, though, that it was done, I think is important in itself. And I wish that this could be transferred to similar projects in the country. Whether the current government is thinking of this kind of thing or not, I doubt. But even on smaller projects in municipalities, they should go afield, bring in the best possible designers they can get, as Calvert did at Expo. And the best possible designers in different areas. If you're experienced in things such as waterfront and marina development, get the best person for that job. If someone is concerned and has experience in erosion and slope control and plant materials, then they can be brought in. But for some reason, Expo didn't really, it was a seed project, and I thought these seeds would grow. They haven't really, I don't think, grown as much as we all expected. Quite often, projects of this kind do this, though. I can think of a number of others, the St. Lawrence Seaway being another one, which was a great hope for a tremendous development, but it has not grown. And I guess others in different parts of the country can think of others which are similar. So there is a danger in this great big mega project because there's no sustenance afterwards. There doesn't appear to be a carry-through afterwards, and without that, and we have nobody to blame for this. Perhaps landscape architects should have picked up on that and through publicity and through the CSLA and the various agencies which we work with, been able to have continued it so that you had not only the marvelous aroma of Expo 67, but you're able to have a little scent that can continue on into the future.
Did Calvert conscientiously hire Canadian landscape architects?
Oh yes, very definitely.
Canadians?
Yeah. He had some strong feelings about the Canadian Society of Landscape Architects, and specifically public works and private practice, because he had feeling for both, having worked in both areas.
So could it be said then that Expo 67 was one of the first major Canadian landscape architecture designs? Is there something, is there a bringing together there of Canadian ideas that that one could see in a visual sense? Is there something there that's visually very Canadian?
Well, it's back to the same question about is there. It's Canadian in the sense that if you back off and take a bird's eye perspective of it, you can see the island of Montreal and the St. Lawrence River going by, and in the wintertime, snow on the ground. And so it's local. It's a Quebec landscape. The stone which was used all over that island for cost reasons was stone, in most cases, from the island. New materials, many of them Canadian, many European, because this was the beginning of the use of pavement in concrete, the unit pavers, Unilock and some of these others which are at the present time used throughout the world. I think Expo started off on promoting some of those materials. But again, I don't know. It was an expression of Canadian enthusiasm and Canadian capital building it, as well as Canadians being able to welcome others from all over the world and give them assistance here so they could build here and interpret their both language and their materials where they came from into a Canadian context. But in that sense, it was Canadian.
But and then you said that it didn't really, it planted the seeds, but it didn't really produce the tree and the branches that you'd hoped for. Perhaps you saw that from a member of the profession at an established point of view. Do you think that for someone at a very early stage, someone in high school, that there would be a different reaction to Expo? Do you think that increased awareness of landscape architecture? Do you think that helped the blossoming of schools of landscape architecture, for instance, in Canada? Do you think that it had that kind of impact?
Oh, I think it may have, because I remember working with the group when we were setting up the school in Guelph. One was able to say that this happened because of Canadian landscape architects, and that therefore there would be a need for it. So I think it was helpful in this respect. It was helpful on paper. Whether it actually did, it was a good example of a thing which at that time worked well. I say at that time because it wouldn't work the same way today. And so I think it was instrumental, and it would focus for the younger person the fact that, yes, because they would be then told, if they were interested in landscape architecture, that here was an example of landscape architecture, and if you went to Guelph or University of Toronto, you could do things of this kind and collaborate with architects on great public buildings and work with engineers on the damming of rivers and irrigation and other things related to that type of landscape. So I think in that respect, I'd agree with anybody that said it helped. It did help. I think it helped. I just would like to find ways of doing things like that at a smaller scale. The smaller scales could be more regional, and it wouldn't be a great pouring of money into a particular thing. But it could produce good regional works of landscape architecture. And you'll be hearing from other people from other parts in the country, and they'll tell you about their particular regional thing. I'm very fortunate here, as are all landscape architects working in Ottawa, because we're financed here by funds from coast to coast, and so that a lot of the federal parks and properties are, it's possible to hire landscape architects to work on them. In fact, policies at the National Capital Commission at the present time are that they retain landscape architects from the Maritimes, from all the provincial associations, and in fact, the fee structures are even adjusted so that increased cost to an office, architect, engineer, landscape architect, working from British Columbia in Ottawa, there's an evener, so the playing field is even, and those expenses are paid so that we can bring professionals from all across the country to work on the national capital. We being taxpayers. And then, so it's not only favoring the Ottawa landscape architects, although we get a lot of spin-off on the smaller jobs. Most of the larger design jobs go to landscape architects. They're invited, they bring in their qualifications, and quite likely competition being fair and above board, which it is with the most of these landscape architectural jobs at the National Capital Commission. The firm from out of province or away from the national capital is brought in. And that kind of thing could be repeated. Provinces could not necessarily only favor people from that particular province, but they can bring in other landscape architects and specialists related to landscape architecture, which brings me to something too. You have another question? It's I mentioned the word specialist, and I have some feelings about this, and I don't have any answers, but I have some questions, and perhaps you'll be able to raise them with some of the other interviewees and some of the landscape architects that have been in practice. When I look at individuals who were practicing with me from the, say, 60s on through, some of the offices have stressed the fact that they were planning firms. Now, these are firms that were even started with partners in landscape architecture, but who may have combined with engineers and architects. And so the fact that, say, some of these practitioners are landscape architects seem to be lost. And they're either whether they're with the civil service or whether they're with the private practice, they're hired as urban designers. They're hired as conservationists They're hired as site planners. They're hired as horticulturalists. They're hired as, and you can list as from the CSLA list of components of landscape architecture, all these other subsections. And private practice has tended to, if there was a big push on for conservation of natural resources and large-scale conservation regional planning, they become regional planners. And somehow that sells the work a little better than saying you're a landscape architect. What I've done by design in D.W. Graham & Associates, which was what we called our office, has been trying to keep us as generalists, namely landscape architects who will take on any project. But as a general practitioner in medicine and as a general practitioner in landscape architecture, you do need to, if you see somebody has a particular problem, and it's an engineering one, and you bring in the best engineer for, say, control of flooding or for irrigation. And so we've never advertised ourselves as urban designers, but if I have an urban design project, I'll collaborate with a firm of landscape architects or engineers that are, helpful in that regard. But I've tried to maintain a firm which was a general practice. Now, there are quite a few in Canada that do this, but a lot of the leading lights, I like to think of myself as a leading light, but many of the other leading lights have done both. They do a general practice, but at the same time, they're best known as urban designers, or best known as regional or conservation planners. And so we lose a bit in that when it's published as the planners did this rather than the landscape architects did this. And I know this is self-serving perhaps, but we spoke recently of Expo 67 and the fact that I think perhaps the ball wasn't carried on that afterwards to really stress the fact that landscape architects influenced that site so strongly, but in collaboration with the engineers and the architects and the planners. But that really landscape architects were able to physically change many things on that site because of their doing. So I think my point is a simple one. I'm just overcomplicating it here, but the point's a simpler one, that with people that you're interviewing, you'll find people who either they're with government service and they're called a planner. At the present time, many municipalities have no designation for landscape architects. They're all called planners. So you're sort of lost in there when it comes out and the thing occurs in the paper. In other words, our face isn't up front as landscape architects. And I've often wished that many of the landscape architects of my generation had perhaps pushed a little more the fact that they were in it as landscape architects and not just as planners. I don't mean just, I'm not saying it's less. It is only from the public's point of view, not landscape architecture. And this goes back to the earlier question about plant materials and the image of landscape architecture. We have no problem with that. We're immediately accepted with the image of being plant material people or designers. It's a little harder to get away from that and try and stress the fact that you also do an urban design thing with no plants and hard material. Now this argument has been there since Olmsted's time. But for some reason, and that's why I say it's a question rather than sort of any pundit recommending that you do a particular thing with this, because I'm not doing that. I'm saying this is a question to a lot of the young landscape architects coming in. And I had a feeling when I was at a lecture at Guelph that I was participating in with Cecilia Payne and Jim Taylor a few weeks ago. The questions from the students indicated they were looking for specialties almost too early. They were there, not even graduated, but some in graduate school, since they do have a graduate program, were immediately looking for specialties, and even the undergraduates were looking for specialties. One was asking me, do you think there'd be a good field in bike paths? Like I could get into bicycle systems. Well, as I mentioned before, I wonder about that, particularly at a student stage. And yet I don't wonder about it, but I pose the question on why a lot of private offices and government departments cannot. And I think we have to assist government departments. Private practice has to assist them in changing designations and making sure that landscape architects' faces are available and ready to do the work, and then subsequent to the work, that they're there as being the people who have created the particular work of landscape architecture. And it's a work of landscape architecture, perhaps, as well as a work of urban design, or a work of regional planning, or a work of highway and traffic control. It's fascinating. This is now being looked at by the Ontario Association of Landscape Architects and the other components of CSLA through their marketing proposals. How can we market it, which is for the future, which you market based upon what you've done in the past. And so far, I'm hoping I can, through the people that I've worked with in my office and people I've worked with in government, I hope we can all say we've done something. Now, how do you market this as, say, look at, this was done in Quebec City, this was done in Montreal, this was done in Toronto. And some of the practitioners in Toronto are doing a great job on this. They're upfront, they are publishing, they are active in public meetings, they're even active politically, which is something that many landscape architects stay away from. Not that we would need to be prime minister, but perhaps more people could get into the politics of government as landscape architects.
At least the lobbying efforts of it anyway.
Yeah, at least. Lobbying in an intelligent way, not in a belligerent or self-serving way. Because our aims are very similar to those aims of any professional group. It is for the safety, the enjoyment of life, and for the continuance of a particular profession. It's able to offer these things. It's fascinating. It has to do with history translated into today's terms and then being marketed to the future. And I'm pleased to see that CSLA is involved in this on our behalf, and that we're able to participate in it through CSLA. It's perhaps the best way to do it.
And that may be something that CSLA should be more aware of in terms of programming, some things that they should be doing.
Yeah. So those were sort of the relationship between jobs, but going back to my little triangle about the people on top of the thing, and the people being both the practitioners and the people that we were in fact designing for, relating to land and buildings, and that is expressed in so much work that I've been so fortunate to have been able to do. Right? Because without a client, private practice doesn't go anywhere. Without the ability to make a profit, and I found even the students aren't getting this, you have to make a profit. Without a profit, you're not in business. Once you've spent your bankroll, you're out of it. You then look around for another job that somebody else hopefully will be able to make a profit on by using your particular expertise. Now, you don't need to, this is the word profit is looked at a little askance by some of the young professionals, and they shouldn't. I don't know, there must be another course they could give for the profit hungry. Looking at it as not profit hungry so much as being profit bottom line has to show a profit. And that's why I quite often mention that over a period of years, X number of fees were charged. And they have to be charged. And they have to be high enough to support payment of your background in education and a lifestyle which you would like to uphold in comparison to others in say, a similar education and in a similar role. But it's what I was going to say was I was trying to relate this to the civil service, where the profit motive isn't there. The motive to some people in practice in the civil service is to save money. They are there and they are saving money. Anybody that tells me that, I immediately give them my speech on they're not there to save money, they're there to spend money wisely. And the best way to spend the money, that's the taxpayers' money wisely, is to hire the best possible landscape architect on that particular job, because that landscape architect will spend those monies and funds. The fee was only a small part of it, but the funds which are being spent on the particular land development be spent wisely. And that sometimes perks up an ear, or at least causes a bit of a change in philosophy, because without those landscape architects that are working as civil servants in public works, many of the jobs don't come down the pipe to other landscape architects. For many years, and I think it still is true, A lot of the jobs coming down the pipe now from agencies that are practicing conservation, environmental control, many of the issues which are so important, seemingly not to the government right now, but they will always surface. Those jobs are going to the biologists, going to the scientists, because there appears for some reason to be, and many others of course too, but I'm just saying biologists, scientists oriented things, because in the public's mind, in the taxpayer's mind, these are the people who are or have the information and the cleverness to turn things around and plug the hole in the ozone layer, et cetera, et cetera. And so therefore then they can spend funds upon these particular consultants and practitioners of, say, any particular field.
It's very interesting because when I was speaking with Roman Fawchuk, his comment was that one of the areas where landscape architects have not done what they should do is being involved in environmental issues. And he said, what does a biologist know about the environment that a landscape architect doesn't know? He said, a biologist might know certain scientific things, but a landscape architect knows the integration of man and nature, not just nature, which is how he sees the biologist as simply having that small sphere, whereas the landscape architect can integrate the two. And he says landscape architects should be the ones on the soapboxes on environmental issues more than biologists, for instance, or other pure scientists. So that's...
Well, that's good. Roman hasn't lost any of his strong philosophical basis, but he reminds me, as just now with your comment, that yeah, so right, Roman. That's so correct. But I might ask the business of, again, and I mentioned the biologist, and this isn't that biologists are doing anything wrong, but the training of most people in the science end, which Suzuki is doing so well on television these days. It's too bad Suzuki is not a landscape architect, but in a way he is, you see, but he doesn't perhaps realize that, because he's always talking about the effects of his science knowledge on the landscape. And in a way, Suzuki is almost playing the role of landscape architect here, because he's acting like a designer, because he's suggesting that the scientist can change the landscape. But the only difficulty, based on Roman's comment, I think, and it's a very valid one, is that the landscape architect going through school, or an architect, any of the design professions, the interior designers and so on, they're given the feeling that they can change things. They change things by design, as it were. And they have a little process where they can do this. Now, most scientists are told they can change things too, but they're told that through research they will discover certain things, and by the research process they'll find out new things, and they can apply it to something new. But in there is this little spark that I think the landscape architect is given, a different kind of a spark. Everybody's given a spark going through school, but the landscape architect is perhaps given a spark as a student and said that at this stage between the time when they've got all this information on the table, all this research information, and when they change that and through their analysis create the concept, that's where the spark occurs. And this is the difference between the biologist and perhaps Suzuki and Roman Fawchuk. Roman Fawchuk, Don Graham, Brad Johnson, all the others on your list, take this particular phase and they make something difficult into something fairly simple. In the sense is a good design is relatively simple and is going to serve people in some way. I think the point might be made that this particular spark is unique to landscape architects and architects in the design professions. And this is lost sometimes in the process of design if a person is a scientist or a doctor or a lawyer or someone else involved in the whole system of changing things in the world. But the thing that I find fascinating is this aspect here, as that particular magic place where, and since we're talking landscape architects today, where the landscape architect can in fact make a positive decision and change something, whereas I do believe that others don't want to change so much. They'd rather maintain a safe status quo and make adjustments so that that doesn't change a great deal. Whereas I think a lot of the landscape architectural approach lends itself to change. And change is inevitable. Change is what we can really count on. Those are not my feelings. But the French say, le plus ça change, le plus c'est la même chose. The more things change, the more they're exactly the same. So we can change things and divert a river, whereas the environmentalists, the biologists won't want to divert that river. The Corps of Engineers divert rivers, and look at the problems we had in the mid-United States because of some of the levees and things that were done. I would suggest, no, I won't. I say if a landscape architect had done that, they wouldn't have flooded. No, they would have, of course. But if it had been done with a landscape architect, perhaps more, they could have made these big changes, but then they would have been more like nature, or they would have been more in other words, he may have been able to coordinate the works of the Corps of Engineers, of the biologists, of the limnologists, of the people involved with fishing, and of the people involved with transport, with the barges, and have created a new thing. And that's my soapbox, the same as Roman's soapbox. But it's not too often marketed. This spark, this special thing you come to an architect, to a landscape architect, to a designer for. You don't come to a biologist for that. You come to a biologist if you're worried about the scum on the surface of the water, or the birds are not, in fact, surviving. And you wonder why. Okay, that particular individual, with all due respect, will tell you why, and he'll give some solutions for ameliorating the situation and improving it, so the bird life will increase. But his method of doing it and the landscape architect's method of doing it will be different. And if they can work together, that's what I'm advocating. Not either or, but together as a team, they'll accomplish what this particular magic that the landscape architect has and his cohorts in the design field can bring to the picture. That's about it. But that's a good question, and you might raise this with others who would have had the similar experience, because if there could be a theme to all of this history, which we're talking history. I'm speaking from history rather than somebody who started yesterday. You sort of say,
Day before.
Yeah, the day before. If we could say, and if it could be edited to some way to focus on the fact that there is this magic thing. I say magic because it's different with each individual. Each landscape architect handles it in a slightly different way, depending on where they're from and whether their personality is extrovert, introvert, romantic, traditional, all the good little facets of personality. And it's one that is it's bigger than landscape architecture. It's somehow getting people to buy this spark. I often think of the old Greek things, the person carrying the torch. If anything's burning, if anything's the torch, it's not because I know the trees and shrubs. It's not because I know that water runs downhill. I mean, they told me that in kindergarten. It's somehow or other, in I think each of us, there is a kind of a spark you could sell. And I think landscape architects have this particular little magic spark that it'd be nice to somehow see where it was in history. Olmsted had a particular thing. He was looking for relief. He could see the future. He was looking for relief from the population so it could come out into a green space. He didn't foresee what it would be like totally, but he saw something. Yeah. And it'd be great if people such as ourselves could move with the same vision. I say spark. It has to do with vision. It's the vision, the spark. Government likes the word vision, so I sort of leave it aside. Pick another word. Yeah.
Well, maybe just kind of, do you feel that you've covered enough on the projects that you've worked on?
Oh yeah, we touched the projects. You're looking at the history. We talked about the persons who may have influenced different landscape architects and myself.
Maybe we'll do sort of the profession. I think we've talked a little bit about how landscape architecture differs in Canada and the United States.
Yes, we talked about that.
Projects in Canada. How do you think the nature of the profession has changed from the time you started until what you're practicing today? How do you see that change? Or do you see a change?
Mm-hmm. I found that, I saw the question here too. I was trying to think of something before that I could neatly fit into place on that. I wasn't able to find any neat fit. Because in some regards it has changed, only because people are practicing differently if they were brought up in the 60s than if they were brought up in the 30s and 40s. And if they're going through school now, I don't know how they're going to practice. And they'll change the profession. Certainly the scenery hasn't changed. It's the people. And so it has always interested me in talking with students. And here again, anybody practicing has to be exposed to young students. Otherwise, they're practicing in a vacuum. Plus, they need to be available and open to any new research that has been going on, either at the schools or within the other field. And so when you look at the history of the professions, has it changed? Well, we have a lot more information available to us now more quickly. It's almost like information overload right now with the computer coming forward with the quick access to so much. And whole companies now supply landscape architects with information of this kind. So that's a change. But I don't see a change physically in the type of work coming out. New work being done in Montreal by the process is still the same, and the things that the designers pick up in the process of going through the process as they're analyzing things. But as they're analyzing things, the student that graduated 3 years ago from the University of Montreal will analyze it slightly differently because their roots aren't back in the 60s or the 50s. And so we'll see a change there. But I don't see much difference in the experimentation that, say, Garrett Ekbo was doing in the 50s in California from what we're doing at Parc Berry in Montreal now. Parc Berry is a departure from the normal Olmsted open space green walkway into a more abstract or art expression in the park. And Parc Berry is something I think all the landscape architects should take a look at. And they should also take a look at the Mount Royal Park, which is right next to it, which was done by Olmsted. And they should look at some of the stuff that was done by Ekbo, of course, and other places in the United States. And then ask themselves how they interpret this when they're doing their analysis. Are they willing to take the pieces of abstract art or of abstract landscape design? I say abstract since it is not just how a tree grows, but it's how a particular edge is cut or how a concrete form is sculpted. And that doesn't bother me any. Like, although I may not understand why Peter did Parc Berry and Philippe did Parc Berry the way they did it, that was because of the way they analyzed it and the way they interpreted their analysis and synthesized it. I'm getting off to the side again. But anyway, when you look at it, is that a change? Well, I really don't know. I don't see that it is a big change. It's just an individual trying something else. And there will be reflections from that in other parks, both in Montreal and around the world, because they'll see, hey, something was tried. The influence that Burle Marx had on the luxurious growth of plant materials and leaf and his very organic forms that he developed in Brazil, they've influenced the landscape architect working in Yellowknife, but instead of using tropical plants, he's into something else. Anyway, that's just to digress there a little bit, that's a very interesting point in terms of kind of the international scope of landscape architecture, that there can be something done somewhere, of course, because travel is so much accomplished so much more easily now than it has been in the past. Something that is done in Brazil can have an influence in Canada in terms of parts of the design. You're right. The availability of the visual images in the magazines, whether they're the ASLA magazine, Landscape Architecture, or our Canadian publications, or all of the others, many of them from Europe, which are excellent, and South America. But again, the designer looks at the image and says, hey, look at that form. Wouldn't that be great in Halifax? Okay. But before the form is put in Halifax, does it represent an Inca image? Is it something that, say, he has taken from the Inca civilization? Or does it come from the Micmac Indian who lived nearby in Halifax and did certain things with the way they planned their settlements. And so how is he going to interpret it? But the richness of stuff available gives us this information, which I say can almost overload this analysis stage. And if it's just copied, of course. I saw one designer who was just copying on the ground various well-known paintings by Picasso. I thought that was a little ridiculous. It was a lot of fun, but a particular line on the Picasso sketch would be done with a piece of concrete, and the gravels would be the texture. But I didn't see that that was doing anything for anybody, unless it was just for fun. And there are times when you do things just for fun in a garden, as Lenôtre did in Paris at the various Versailles gardens, the various Versailles fun gardens, where little squirts would come out, or a vista would suddenly appear, and it would just be a complete fake. And I think there are times for that can happen, but not in this sort of philosophical vein of where is landscape architecture going in Canada.
Picasso, that was a good place.
Yeah.
Maybe I'd like to ask you a couple of questions about the future of the profession in Canada. Where do you see landscape architecture going, and how do you see the future with landscape architects in it?
Well, I see them in it. Whether they change the name or not, or whether they do specialize in plant material or engineering structures. But it's like a crystal. It's fun to crystal ball read and try and think of how it would go. If I were to influence the crystal ball at all, I would like there to be a healthy economy, because without the healthy economy, no one is spending money on works or changing the environment to any great degree. Certainly not purchasing the services of landscape architects and engineers and architects. So first of all, a healthy environment, which we can help to bring about by our role in the whole picture of employment. So we can employ landscape architects, so we can pay them salaries, so they can spend it on new cars and bigger houses and things of that kind. But that the future will develop accordingly. The future stress, if anything, as I said, could be related to more people involved in private practice. Because I think if we have more people in private practice, they are faced with the day-to-day reality of profit, of fees, of individual expression, and that at the same time there has to be a growth. And I see it happening naturally, because communities now are looking for advice on their open space, on the redevelopment of their main street, of the improvement to their reservoirs and this kind of thing. So they're bound to need them. So that if there can be a balance of growth, although I'd like to see the balance predominantly, say, 80% in private practice, because I happen to have a particular love for that. That's personal, though. But it has a professional ramification, is because the government will draw from private practice. The people that are employed by private practice can then move to government positions with some knowledge about what it's like. Some people say it's the real world. I don't know if it's the real world in private practice or not. There's a real world in the government service, just as real. And however, I sort of see a balance in this future landscape architectural game, with the schools continuing, with the schools having a feeling for what the profession can absorb, and the changes that are happening out in the country, changes of economics and politics and materials. But I don't know, does that sound, it sounds as if I were to sort of crystal ball create with this spark. The spark would be to try and encourage more people into private practice. And this hasn't been happening in the last 10 years. There's been a discouragement because of dollars available. And dollars aren't available because governments don't see them to be available in that particular area. And why don't they see them? Because the taxpayer doesn't see them. Why doesn't the taxpayer see? Because our marketing and our jobs that we have done are not getting through to them. And so we are being hired third on the list instead of, say, second or first on the list. But so any work we can do in marketing will reflect in the future. Any work that the teachers and the professors and the students do at schools will reflect on the future more than anything else. And I only feel that I feel too for my colleagues at my age, what we can do is perhaps focus on some of the things we've been doing in the past so that they're able to sell this, and hopefully these are good enough that it will look good to people, and therefore they will be able to sell their rendition of this in the 90s and in 2000. Because in 2000, what are we going to do about the motor car? I mean, it can't go on the way it is. Something has to happen with the car and transportation. Something has to happen in northern cities. If we keep building northern cities, the same as we build subdivisions around Miami, that's a change I see. Somehow, a lot of research has been done in northern Canada on this. And perhaps here is an area that didn't occur to me before where Canada can lead and become Canadian. Northern type settlements take full advantage of the 4 seasons would be, again, something for the future. That we stress this ability to cope with cold weather, hot weather, and the extremes. Anyway, I'm putting in a plug for private practice. I would like to see more private practice because I believe those are the grassroots, the growth, the training area for people who can then function in public service. Because public service, in some ways, I'm making it sound as if public service might be an ultimate role, and in many ways it is. In my way, I tried to make landscape architecture at NCC. So did Don Pettit, who was there for many years. So did Edward I. Wood. Pettit followed Wood. So did Ed Holyubovich, who you will be talking to. And all of us have tried at this level of government to make landscape architecture one of the more key things. But in the last 20 years, the key people in government appear to be not the scientist, not the architect, not the landscape architect, but people who've been involved in management from whatever field it may be. They have dropped this spark, namely the design end of things, the design role, and taken up with a management role. And all senior mandarins seem to grow from a management role. And in my own situation, with Don Pettit, Ed Holyubovich, and Ed Wood, in most of the cases, the top positions have gone to, an advancement within the agency has gone to those which specialized in management. Quite often growing out of the legal profession, growing out of the, well, if you have a bachelor in commerce or education or arts and you go into management, these are often